Welcome back to Stop Feeling Like Shit. Today we're tackling one of the biggest misconceptions in nutrition, the ideal that calories are created equal. Not. So, when it comes to sugar, the impact on your body goes way beyond just calorie count. In this episode, we're diving deep into the truth about sugar, how it affects your health, energy, and mood, and why it's one of the biggest culprits behind feeling like crap. Ready to get the facts and take control of your life? Let's break it down. Once again, I'm your host, Daniela Korth, with Dr. Buzz. And on today's episode, we have our special guest. He's back, Joe Matovich. And our episode, Not All Calories Are the Same, the truth about sugar. Ooh, I'm loving this one. I can't wait.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, seriously, because
Yep.
we're all addicted to sugar, I think, in some form. I mean, maybe we're not,
Everybody
but I mean, we
everybody,
all like sugar.
Everybody likes sugar.
Yeah, we
Let's
all
just
love
get that out
sugar.
there. Everyone
Yeah.
likes sugar. Who doesn't
Yeah,
like sugar?
I mean, okay. So yeah, and also we need to talk about how many different diets can we go on,
Yeah.
you know? So we have all these different diets, and so let's talk about the diets first.
Okay.
I don't know. I think Buzz likes intermittent fasting, and I personally don't like intermittent fasting. I think a lot of people that work out, they're always counting their calories. And then you have keto, right?
Yep.
And then you have the carnivore diet. Am I missing any?
Keto, carnivore, intermittent fasting. Those are the big ones. Paleo.
Oh, yeah.
Mediterranean.
diet.
Oh, yeah.
Vegan diet. Yeah.
I mean, which one of these do you say have the most success out of all these? Because a lot of people, I think what they do is, okay, I'm going to start a diet, especially the first of the new year, right? I'm going to get
Right.
on this diet. Well, which diet am I going to do? And so they always want to do the low carb thing, I think, right? That's what people are used to. They want to avoid the sugars.
the old school Atkins. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I try to, especially when handling patients, stay away from the term diet. Diet, whether we admit it or not, has a negative connotation in our brains to it. It sounds like something of complete deprivation. And I feel like for a lot of patients, that's setting them up for failure, right?
Yeah, I don't
'Cause
like
they're-
I don't like the word
first
diet
three
either.
letters is die.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're right.
Well, and you think about this whenever you tell somebody, this is your diet, this is all you can eat, and these are all the things you can't eat, and you got to do it forever. And then people are like, it turns into something where it's like, I'll do this for 3 months, I'll do this for 6 months, I'll do this for whatever. And we all know that if you want to have meaningful change as far as health, wellness, and longevity, it needs to be a meaningful lifestyle change. So in terms of, there's benefits to all of the things we talked about in moderation. I think everybody's a little bit different. I think there's obviously individual variability as far as dietary preference, what people respond to. I know Buzz loves intermittent fasting. I don't like intermittent fasting either. I feel like crap if I don't eat
I
in
don't
the
like
morning.
it.
And I don't like eating, you like to work out on an empty stomach. I don't.
I
like
do
to do
too.
a amount of carbs before I train. So there's little nuances like that.
Could be everyone's biochemistry is a little bit different.
For sure.
Yeah.
Blood, I know blood type has some stuff to do with it. Like there's other factors, obviously.
Right.
Yeah, except for if you travel with Buzz, right? We go somewhere. I mean, I know he's trying to starve me out because he's used to intermittent fasting.
Yeah.
And then I'm like, dude, it's 11:30. Like, I'm starting to get violent now because I haven't eaten yet.
Yep, and that's one of the things, dude. Now at the right conference, you give me enough like NAD and stuff like that. I can work all day not to eat.
Yeah,
but-
NAD and nicotine
NAD
curbs
and
the appetite.
nicotine, exactly. Then I'm good. Then I can go for 3 days. But so I think there's a lot of variety based on individual differences. Different, like you said. I think bioenergetics a little bit different. How people respond to different foods. So I don't want to say any one diet's better than the other. If you ask my preference, I lean heavier into maybe like a 40-30-30 protein, carb, fat. On off days, 30-40, 30 carb or protein, carb, fat split, almost like a paleo type diet. Really, for most patients who are just looking for general health, wellness, and weight reduction, I don't know that any one of those single diets necessarily fits the bill. It's more about food selection and portion control, right?
Yeah. And I think, like, when I talk to people, everyone will say, like, oh, what do you eat?
Yeah.
And they think I'm like fit in their eyes, which I probably am, right? To the general public. And they'll say, what diet are you on? And I'm like, I don't even like the word diet. I don't go in diets. I like to eat whole foods.
Right.
I like to eat good foods.
Yeah. And we see that a lot too. And I think as you guys have experienced, none of us are little eaters. Like we all eat a fair amount of food. And what I do tell a lot of patients is Now, don't get me wrong. You're a figure competitor. You're a bodybuilder. Yeah, you're going to be counting macros and counting calories and weighing food. A lot of people, if you've got kids, you got a busy lifestyle, you're just looking for general. Most people are going to find that process tedious and cumbersome and hard to sustain.
Right.
But if you start eating whole foods, if your carbohydrates are generally low glycemic in nature, eating quality fats and quality proteins, body composition tends to change fairly appropriately regardless of caloric intake in absence of the extremes, right? If you eat 6,000 calories of really good food, you're still gaining weight. If you eat 800 calories of really good food, you're going to lose weight. But most patients, if they eat to their normal rhythm and fullness and food selection is of quality, you're going to see positive changes in body morphology, reduction of subacute and visceral adipose tissue, improved blood metrics and things like that. So for me, I'm not necessarily a prescriber to any one diet, although I do use some of them to help people structure what they're doing. I think food selection is really what people need to focus on.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's what I talk to the most with people is when they're selecting their food. I always ask them, like, take me through a day of what you're eating. Like, where are you getting your food from? And they'll say, well, where are you getting yours from? And I'm like, well, I eat whole foods. I don't like processed foods. I don't like fast foods. I also don't eat things out of cans unless obviously they're like pickled, homemade things. But I don't like that type of food. And the reason why is because one, it doesn't make me feel good. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people, if you are eating processed foods or just foods that aren't good for you and they're not whole foods, you will typically experience, bloating immediately. It just doesn't make you feel well, right?
Yeah.
And so, I agree with
I think
you.
we realized too, that we've been traveling, not around the world, but in a lot of different countries recently. And you see people in other countries and they tend not to be as big. Mm-hmm. But you go to their grocery stores and they don't have all the garbage we have. Like they just have fruits, vegetables, meats.
My favorite grocery store ever is the grocery store in Aruba. It is amazing, right? They have all fresh stuff. Their meat selection is beautiful. I'm just like, wow, why didn't we just get a house and just buy this food and make it? Because, it doesn't have all the junk that our food has in it, So that's another thing. So even, I think, obviously, if you're able to quit eating the fast food, processed foods, and jump to whole foods, that's a start. Then the next level up, to me personally, would be like actually kind of like what Yellowbird does, buying it straight from the source.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people too. Part of it, I think, is a flaw in all systems of healthcare, education, FDA in the United States. I was looking at something the other day, and don't quote me exactly on the statistics, but it was something like 72% of all the food in grocery stores in the States is considered what would be classified as ultra processed, which ultra processed would basically, to simplify that, would be give any of the three of us all the ingredients in a 5-star kitchen, and we still couldn't turn that food into the end product that's in the package. Yeah. But, everybody's busy. The economy's kind of a train wreck. People look for convenience, and I think there's a lot of miseducation, or I think there's a complete lack of education in the traditional American medical
think
system.
Of school. Think of when your kids go to school, the garbage are fed.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So you would think what you get at school would be healthy, and that's probably the worst garbage you could have.
Yeah.
So
lunchroom pizza, chicken nuggets.
Yeah, like
tater tots, chocolate
That chocolate milk and pizza was my favorite though growing up.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, but here's the thing:
So-
you can get away with it as a kid sometimes,
right.
But once you get older, you're.
But the habit starts as a kid.
Yeah.
The habit starts as a kid.
Yeah, so it's I think part of that, and then like you said, getting into something like Yellowbird, and then if you wanted to get into the real nitty gritty when we're doing things like GI mapping and things, then we're getting even more specific into actual, if you would consider dietary prescribing based on food sensitivities and changes in the bacterial flora that may influence food processing. But that's like way down a rabbit hole. That would be a whole other conversation.
Oh,
right?
I agree. And it's like, I tell people too, is when they talk about these diets and things, I'm always like, listen, if there's one thing that you can do, be gluten-free.
Right.
And I tell them that, like, really focus on staying away from the gluten, right? And the bad sugars, which, by the way, we need to get into.
Yep.
So let's talk about that. So sugars.
Yes.
We have processed sugars and we have carbs.
Right.
And then, so break it down for us. Like, when people see, it's so funny because when you go in the store, it's like, oh, no added sugar.
No added
No
sugar.
added sugar, just the sugar that's already in it. Yeah. So carbohydrates, and I think a lot of people, the reason people go to keto is it's, which I don't like, or carnivore, is the term carbohydrate has been equated to sugar almost synonymously. And really carbohydrates are sugar, starches, and fibers, right? So carbohydrates themselves are not inherently a bad thing. In fact, carbohydrates are fantastic. I mean, they're a good source of fuel to the body. They're great. Your brain needs 80 to 100 grams a day for normal cognition and maintenance. If somebody's interested in building muscle tissue, they need carbohydrates as much as they need protein. So carbohydrates are not bad. And you even look at like fibers and polyphenols are what feed all of our good gut bacteria. So carbohydrates are an absolute necessity. It's the type of carbohydrates that tend to be problematic where people steer wrong. So, and it's funny, a lot of times we'll have patients where I'll say, hey, I want you to cut out bread. I want you to cut out sugar. And they're like, oh, so no carbs.
Yeah,
I'm like,
that's often.
well, no, you can have low glycemic fruits, you can have vegetables, you can have sweet potato, you can have things like that. And they're like, oh, well, those are all carbohydrates too. So I think a lot of people just from a misunderstanding point think that carbs mean bread and sugar.
Yeah, they mean
Right.
bad.
And
Yeah.
it's true too. I think it's really important for people to realize if you're eating the wrong type of carbs, what happens is your body releases a bunch of insulin.
Right.
And the problem with that is when you release insulin, you can't burn body fat.
You're right.
So if you're eating a lot of simple carbohydrates, even if they're eating very few calories,
Right.
but simple carbohydrates, like we'll say, I don't know, bread with every meal or something, that person's going to have a challenge ever losing body fat
Right.
because the insulin's raised. So when your insulin's raised to digest these simple carbohydrates, you can't burn fat. I don't care how much you work out, how few calories you eat. That's the person that the person that eats twice a day nothing and they're still heavy. Well, they're having a cup of coffee and a donut and say that, I only had that and I had dinner.
I love that you say that because that's something too, is people are like, I don't know why I can't lose weight. I'm only eating,
I eat nothing.
this little apple a day, or I'm only eating this celery stick, or I'm eating a potato chip, right?
Yeah. Well, and you look at that with insulin resistance as a whole, right? You're not burning fat immediately, but you also look at with long-term overexposure to insulin at a cellular level, specifically the muscle and liver, which is our primary site muscle, not only of glucose disposal, but also storage. With overexposure to insulin, the receptors become desensitized, which means less of it's going to muscle, liver, and end organ tissue. More is going to facilitate adipocyte growth. A perfect example, what Buzz referenced there is what you would consider what references what's called the glycemic index of a carbohydrate. And
Everyone should look that up, by the way.
Yeah.
That's very interesting. So glycemic index, go ahead and explain what it is.
Yeah,
But
what is
everyone should at least look at it.
so the glycemic index rates food on a scale of 0 to 100. And essentially, the closer a food is to 100, and this is going to be applicable to carbs, the more prone it is to cause an abrupt spike in your blood sugar.
Which when that happens, you're not burning fat.
Right, because you're getting that big abrupt spike in insulin after. So there's a glycemic index and there's a glycemic load. Glycemic index speaks to the magnitude that will spike blood sugar. Glycemic load speaks to actual carbohydrate content. So perfect example, take like a piece of bread, okay? May not have a huge glycemic load in that, maybe it has 20 grams of carbs in it, which is not an astronomical amount, but its glycemic index is really high. So even though there's not a lot of sugar in it, the sugar that is in it is going to immediately hit the bloodstream and it's going to spike your sugar through the roof. Take something like beans and legumes, fairly high glycemic load where they actually are fairly carb heavy, but they're also pretty fiber heavy. So although their glycemic load may be higher, the time that it takes to get them into the bloodstream because of the component of other things like the fibers component of that carbohydrate is a slow timed release that doesn't necessitate a big insulin spike. So that's when you're looking at carbohydrate type, it's more about how does it influence postprandial glucose levels, and then how much of a major insulin spike does it potentiate?
Because the goal is to keep insulin levels as low as possible all day,
Right.
Yeah.
while taking in good
carbohydrates.
carbohydrates, which are low glycemic index carbohydrates.
Yeah, low glycemic index. Yep.
And I thought it was interesting too, like some things that most people might think are healthy, like a carrot. Carrot's very high glycemic index.
So is watermelon. So is pineapple. So are bananas. And,
Raisins, like a lot
Yeah.
of stuff that you think is healthy
Yeah.
is really probably has more nutritional value, but from losing body fat is no better than a candy bar.
Well, even think of, and that's what, you think about like a kid's like munching on like yogurt covered raisins or something like that. It's raisins and yogurt. It must be a good snack.
Yeah.
But again, like you said, you might as well eat a chocolate bar as far as the impact on glucose. There may be slightly higher levels of actual nutrients, but the end metabolic consequence is still the same.
It's not worth it.
Well, let's talk about okay, we're going back to sugars, right?
Okay.
And I want you to explain to the audience because you just said like there's a difference between sugars, right?
Yep.
And so I want them to understand over time, what do these sugars start to do to the body?
Okay.
Yeah.
So sugar, you're looking at like glucose, fructose, sucrose.
Yes.
And all of those are sugar molecules that they are molecularly very close to each other. And because they're simple or refined, like a simple sugar, essentially, think of this in a nutshell. When you eat a simple sugar that doesn't have a fibrous or starchy component to it, there's not a lot of processing that's required of the body. So the time from mouth to gut to bloodstream is a very, very quick hit, right? So uptake's very quick. Now, like we talked about, the immediate end result is inability for fat metabolism, obviously onset of insulin resistance. If we're talking about long game, what is the real end organ consequence is when we get into things like diabetes, okay? Now, a lot of people have heard of what's called a blood test. It's called a hemoglobin A1C. Now, what most people are not familiar with is what that actually measures. So what it measures is a process called glycation, glycalization, whatever you want to call it. And I explain this to patients as saying, simplistically, sugar is sticky inside the body just like it is outside, right? So when you have an excess of sugar in the blood that you don't clear appropriately, that sugar is going to cause damage and duress and stress to a various number of tissues in the body. It's going to destroy the myelin sheath that surrounds nerve fibers. It's going to damage the endothelial membrane of blood vessels and increase likelihood of vascular disease, which is why 80% of diabetics don't die from diabetes. They die from cardiovascular disease, right? So that's where we see things like vascular degeneration and neuropathy and things like that, because essentially an overabundance of sugar in your body just destroys our cells, destroys our tissues. What an A1C measures is it measures what percent, it's called a hemoglobin A1C, measures what percent of the hemoglobin proteins in our blood are glycosylated or basically enveloped in sugar. So somebody says, oh, my A1C is not that bad, it's 7.5%. Well, that means 7.5% of your oxygen-carrying proteins are glycosylated and therefore non-functional. Extrapolate that out to what's happening to every other tissue in your body. If I told you that 7.5% of all of your cells were in poor condition because they were ravaged by glucose, would you feel particularly healthy, right? So that was a long answer to a short question. But
What do you think a good number on that is then?
A1C, anything less than 5.6 is considered normal. I would say pristine. If you can live right around 5, 4.9, 4.8 is best. And people say it's a 3-month picture of 3-month picture of glucose because it's realistically it's looking at transient changes in glucose levels over the life of hemoglobin, proteins, red blood cells, right?
Yeah.
I think I've said before, glucose mismanagement, prediabetes and diabetes is a Pandora's box of comorbid disease and metabolic syndrome, because once your sugar goes off and that excess accumulation of glucose in your blood starts to have end organ effects on the vascular system and the nervous system and the kidneys and things like that, it is in the other downstream metabolic processes it misregulates. You have opened the door to every other comorbidity in the book.
Stuff.
Yeah.
Is it fair to say too, people that have, there's 2 types of diabetes, type 1, which usually child onset, although it can be adult onset.
Yeah.
That's not reversible.
No, your pancreas just doesn't make insulin, right? Yeah.
But the type 2 diabetes is preventable with diet and nutrition, correct?
Correct.
And reversible.
Yes. Yeah, and a lot of people say you can't cure type 2 diabetes. And I think that people say that because once you have the diagnosis, you always carry the diagnosis in traditional medicine. And you can see type 2 diabetics progress into insulin dependence.
Usually because they're taking drugs.
Because, they overly burden their pancreas for long enough, the beta islet cell fails and quits working, and then you have to take exogenous insulin. But
that's actually what happens to everyone with type 2 eventually, right? They become insulin dependent.
Correct. But most of them are advanced insulin resistance and overwork the pancreas. So if you can correct those glucose issues prior to needing to take exogenous insulin, there is no reason you couldn't get the A1C totally back within normal limits and theoretically eliminate any pharmacotherapy long-term with maintenance of appropriate lifestyle modification. It'll take some doing, but it could be done.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you're
when you say
like,
it takes some doing, it's diet modification. And
yeah,
exercise.
it's what you put in your mouth.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you're sitting around like, well, I have type 2 diabetes, right?
Yeah.
I hear that. And I'm like, okay, so how about we just talk about what you put in your mouth?
Yeah.
and adjust that.
And one of the things that's weird with type 2 diabetics that we tend to see, and I've been with Buckeye for 5 years, but I spent almost a decade doing metabolic disease intervention before this, working with diabetic patients, is when you see that insulin resistance really in advanced diabetes gets so bad that the actual uptake of glucose to target cells like the brain and like the liver and muscle tissue is so bad that you'll have patients where they'll have their blood glucose may walk around at 300 all the time. And
Wow.
they start to get their blood sugar better managed, and they get it down to 130. And for the first 3 to 6 months, they're like, I feel like shit. My blood sugar's better, but I feel terrible. And it's because they haven't corrected that insulin resistance process. So circulating glucose is lower, insulin resistance hasn't repaired yet. So now you have 60% less glucose in the blood, but the same poor delivery.
Right.
And unfortunately, a lot of people, they just quit then because they're like, well, screw that. I felt better with higher blood sugar. They just have to ride that out, and it will eventually resolve subjectively too.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and also, I mean, I always tell people too with their metabolism, right? Sugar turns into fat, right?
Right.
And so you get fat. And
Yeah.
they're like, really? I'm like, yeah. So if you can't burn fat and basically you're eating all this sugar and it's turning into fat, I mean, what a mess, right? And then also another thing is once we start eating all this sugar, we keep craving it more and more and more.
Right.
Well, then we're also feeding the bad bacteria in our gut. And I want you to talk to people about that as well. So they kind of look at me strange when I say, you're feeding your body all these bad sugars and the bad bacteria in the gut love it.
Yeah.
The reason they crave the sugar too is what happens. What goes up must come down. So if you eat a candy bar or a donut, like the worst breakfast in the world is the Dunkin' Donuts.
Right.
A cup of coffee and a donut. So your insulin spikes. So you probably feel really good for a little bit after that donut,
30
right? You get
minutes
the
and then-
dopamine, the insulin. But the higher your insulin goes up, the farther it's going to crash out. And when that insulin comes back down, you're tired and you crave sweets.
Right.
That's why Thanksgiving dinner, you look, for example, when I was a kid, we'd like pig out, turkey, all the stuff,
Turkey,
pie,
stuffing, pies,
stuff.
bread. Yeah.
I'd pass
insulin
out.
through the roof. And then you get really tired, but then you wake up and you're hungry again. Well,
Yeah.
why is that?
Yeah.
Because your insulin crashes because it was so high. And you
And
just
sugar
crave.
crashes. Yep. Sugar crashes, insulin crashes. A lot of patients experience what's called reactive hypoglycemia, where it's that fatigue, that lethargy, that almost out of it. It's your sugar isn't clinically low, but your glucose just went from 250 to 70 in 45 or 60 minutes. So you have hypoglycemic symptoms, although your sugar isn't technically low. And your body's like, oh shit, I need more carbs.
Actually, you feel like shit.
Yeah, you do.
Yeah, you do.
I had
So-
that happen to me on the flight one time, and I was like panicking because you start sweating, and
What'd you eat,
I was like, oh my God, huh?
What'd you eat?
I ate a protein bar or something.
Oh.
I was like, oh my God, I need food right now. I mean, you feel
So
feel
what'd
sick.
You eat? What'd you eat to spike your insulin?
Oh, I don't know. I couldn't even tell you.
Bad.
Yeah.
Who knows?
yeah.
Probably something stupid.
Sorry, I got off topic. And also, Buzz hit a good topic too. He said the dopamine response. So the reason people crave sugar beyond the physiologic process is there is also what's called the dopaminergic response to poor eating behavior, specifically with sugar and refined carbohydrates, which is a neurochemical response in the brain that influences dopamine uptake, where I ate something bad and emotionally I felt good. And it is neurochemically, it's almost identical to what you would see with like narcotic use. So when people say they're addicted to sugar, that's not technically
That's
untrue.
that's a real thing.
Yeah, the neurochemical response is identical. So in regards to the effect on good and bad bacteria, what we know is our good bacteria predominantly, I mean, they need polyphenols and they need fiber, right, to grow and thrive and develop.
That's why like a keto diet or carnivore diet,
Yeah.
you're not feeding your good bacteria in your gut.
Correct. That's why if people are adamant, they're like, I want to do carnivore, I want to do keto, I'm like, no more than 30 days. Because I would aggressively argue, and that's only if they
You probably
refuse-
would lose body fat because you're not spiking your
would.
insulin, but you're destroying your microbiome, which controls your brain chemistry and lots of other stuff.
Right, and I tell people that, and the only reason I say 30 days max is because that's only if they've told me they're doing it anyway. If I
Right.
can talk them out of it, to be honest with you. But the problems you run into there is when you look at, let's say you look at like the exponent doubling life of a lot of our bad bacteria. Take something like methicillin-resistant staph. Its exponential doubling life is 20 minutes, right? So let's say we're eating a lot of things that feed that good bacteria and an insufficient value of things we're feeding all those bad bacteria and feeding and not adequately providing nutrients for good bacteria. I mean, your good bacteria are going to drop and your bad bacteria are going to climb so aggressively. I mean, it takes nothing to potentiate, drive a really aggressive gut infection.
And people have to realize you might not know, and you could live with this gut infection your whole life. It would show up as systemic inflammation, brain fog. Not necessarily the majority of people, but I would say that have gut infections don't have any gut issues.
Well, and that's the same. I had that conversation with a patient today who had been on semaglutide and wasn't losing weight. I said, your gut is 100% the problem. And the number one thing they said is, oh, I don't have gut issues. I go to the bathroom. Like, that's not what I mean. And that's what most gut issues don't necessarily, I mean, some of them, I'd say 40, 50% show up as gut problems, but a lot of them don't. It's the end systemic consequence of what's going on in the gut that we see the most.
Right. Yeah, and a lot of people don't think of that stuff. Well, they're not.
Well, it's kind of like back pain or what they call radicular pain down arms and legs. Some people have to realize 25% of back injuries, you don't have any back pain. It shows up as leg pain or arm pain or shoulder pain.
Well, that's, I mean, case in point, I have a spine fusion. My back almost never bothers me. When my back's flared up, what annoys the hell out of me is my calves burn.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's crazy. Wow.
Gut's the same way.
Gut's the same way.
Yeah, and so we talk about the sugar with the gut, and then also I want us to talk about what sugar does to the brain. Let's talk about that, because, if I eat too much sugar, because Dr. Buzz likes sweets, and he loves them. So
But you buy them.
Well,
sabotage.
I'm not a sabotage. Hey, listen, I've been trying to get better, but when we go to dinner, when you go out to dinner, we kind of like desserts. Yeah.
You do sleep like shit, but
yeah, you do.
You are tired, so
right.
If you have a nice big dinner with a piece of cake afterwards, you're sleeping like a baby, at least in the beginning.
Yeah.
But sometimes we'll really overdo it. And what I notice when we really overdo it, like not only will we sleep like crap, but then like the next day in the morning, it's like my brain is fuzzy. Like I feel like I'm blurry, So talk to us about that.
That's a loaded question. So immediate one-time excess carbohydrate or sugar exposure, right? Probably what you're feeling from a brain standpoint is the really abrupt, insignificant uptake of glucose into the brain, and then a very abrupt crash of glucose back out with that big transient insulin spike. We talked about the dopaminergic response in the brain as far as that modifying the reward center for bad eating behaviors. If we wanted to get into the long-term conversation where we talk about things like diabetes, ravaging the neurovascular system, and then obviously damaging the myelin sheath around nerve cells. So short term, you're going to feel all over the place. You're going to get kicks in dopamine, feel good, and then feel bad. You're going to get cognitive decline almost immediately when you get that big sugar crash. Long term, we're actually talking about really aggressive catabolic processes that causes long-term degenerative changes to the tissue of the brain.
You know what I like too, by the way? We're talking about sugar and stuff and the brain and whatnot. And it makes me think of like children.
Yeah.
When the parents, they're giving their kids for breakfast bowls of cereal.
Yeah.
Which I loved cereal growing up. That's what me and my brothers would eat for breakfast. But now that I'm aware of what the crap is in that, you think of your child, it's like, okay, well, they were good this morning and then I gave them cereal for breakfast, or I gave them the toaster strudel, and then they get to school and they're acting out. Oh, well, wait, your child is bipolar.
Right.
They need medications. No, they need to get off the sugar.
Well, I mean, look at what commercials you see. You see like, oh, Frosted Flakes are enriched whole grain, part of a healthy and nutrition breakfast. I mean, you could put 9,000 other cereals in part of that, where it's being advertised as like, not only is this breakfast food, this is the breakfast food you need and your kids need to be happy and healthy. And then we talked about the influence and changes on the microbiota with metabolic syndrome as far as negative changes in the bacterial flora. And I know this is something we've touched on before. When you look at the influence of the bacterial medium on serotonin and dopamine synthesis, and then even if you want to jump down the rabbit hole of nutrient absorption issues with things like SIBO, how important things like B vitamins are for neurotransmitter production indirectly as well.
Right.
Well, there's a reason there's such an increased prevalence of depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, autism, dissociative identity disorder. Well, kids eat nothing but garbage. They eat nothing but processed garbage. And I would bet a lot of school kids, 75% of their calories are from carbohydrates, refined carbohydrates, or sugars at that.
Yeah. I would agree there. Well, wow. We've covered a lot in a very short time span. But, I think that a lot of people, we like to simplify the diet for them, right?
Yeah.
Would you agree?
Yes.
And we like to also help people understand like what's going on with their body in the clinic. So how about we just walk through like somebody that's experienced what we're talking about? If they came to the clinic, what you would do?
So, let's say somebody just wants generalized dietary intervention, HRT patient, for example, where we see slight elevations in triglyceride values. Maybe their liver functions are a little bit high, which would indicate, hepatic steatosis, non-alcohol fatty liver from visceral fat increasing from insulin resistance. Then we're looking at it again. We're having very basic conversations of things like we just talked about here: low glycemic nutrition, macronutrient timing, and just educating them on whole food. I generally provide them with a food list. I generally give patients a glycemic index, and I keep it very simple. I say, this is your low glycemic section, 55 or less. And I tell patients, live here. This is your moderate glycemic index. Vacation here occasionally. This is your high glycemic list. Avoid at all costs. And I always tell them 90%, 10%, 0. Because I'm very realistic with patients. I'm like, if you can give me 90-10 compliance dietarily,
Yeah.
we're good. Because I'm not unrealistic.
Right.
Now, where it gets way more specific is we have some patients that, want more specific dietary prescribing and intervention. And we certainly get into that a lot with our functional medicine patients. And that's based specifically a lot of times off of food sensitivity and the GI map. So I'll give you an example of something that a lot of times to patients feels counterintuitive. Okay. So let's say we have a patient with a GI map that has low level H. pylori. So they have hypochlorhydria, low stomach acid. Generally, their digestive enzymes are going to be poor. They're going to have undigested fat in the stool. And a lot of times at those cases, we see elevations in what's called their Firmicutes phyla, which is one of their big heavier bacterial fermenters. So we all hear like the best way to boost that bacteria is, raw veggies and fruits. Well, in some cases, those patients are not going to have the digestive capacity to handle a lot of hard and soluble fiber. They just don't process it. And because of the rate of bacterial fermentation, a lot of times if they eat like heavy fermenting veggies, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, garlic, mushrooms, onion, and things like that, especially if they eat them raw, they're going to blow up like a balloon and they're going to feel horrible. So some instances like that, we may say, hey, we need to incorporate more fiber, but you don't handle like the really tough uncooked fibers. So instead of you taking like a Metamucil or a Facilum husk fiber, we're going to use a guar gum fiber to supplement temporarily. I want you eating these vegetables, but for the first 8 weeks, we're only going to bake or steam them. You're not going to eat them raw, things like that. We get into protein selection type. We get into servings of fiber a day. We get into fat content. I mean, we get really in tune with it because at that point for functional medicine, we're using food as medicine.
Yeah.
Right.
And I love that. And I also think that, like what you said, most people think like, okay, let me go eat all these veggies,
Right.
but then they blow up like a balloon. So that's why the testing is so important. So I even think for people like you're just listening to this and you're thinking, I don't have anything wrong with me, but maybe you want to know if you're lacking a certain bacteria, a good bacteria, or you have too much of a bad bacteria and you're eating these things and you're blowing up like a balloon, or you have some type of issue. Like the testing is important.
Well, and there's a pretty common theme we see with patients that are overweight and with metabolic syndrome, and that's an insufficiency of 2 or 3 big bacteria. That first of which is Akkermansia muciniphila. Right now, that produces a lot of the mucus-derived sugars and other things that all the other good bacteria like to eat. It also positively influences insulin sensitivity and caloric extraction from food, so it really helps with metabolic syndrome. The other ones we see are low levels of Faecalibacterium prasinii and Roseburia, which are big butyrate producers. And butyrate's a short-chain fatty acid. It also positively influences insulin sensitivity and metabolic response, has anti-inflammatory properties in the colon, and helps colonic motility. So, semaglutide is a huge drug right now, and we prescribe it. But a lot of times one of the issues we see with patients, if they're stagnating on it or they're coming in from it, is I say, hey, we need to do something else. And a lot of things we see is recurrent themes on that GI map. And a lot of times it's insufficiency in some of those good bacteria that are absolutely crucial for maintenance of appropriate metabolic response.
Right.
Yeah, so anyone who's taken semaglutide and has struggled and not lost weight or got sick to their stomach, most likely the microbiome's messed up.
100%.
Yeah.
100%.
Any of the GLP
So
ones.
and that's a huge problem long term for your health. So if you're listening and you've had struggled with semaglutide or one of the GLP ones, or they made you upset, you really need to get your microbiome tested.
That's something I think you and I talked about not too long ago, where you can go all the way up to 2.5 milligrams of semaglutide, but for most, rarely in absence of true type 2 diabetes does anybody need that big of a dose. And generally, if we get somebody at, a third or fourth hydration dose, 1.5 milligrams, and they're not losing, I almost immediately tell them, hey, if you're not losing at this dose
Right.
and you're just using it for weight reduction, something else is the issue that this isn't repairing. And I would rather allocate your time, my time, financial resources, and efforts into the root cause problem. And if we're not seeing loss here, something else is going on.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. And another thing is, people go through programs to detox from certain things in their life, whether that's alcohol or drug use or whatever. And we talked about sugar, how people are addicted to that. And so, are there detoxes to go through like a sugar? Like, can you detox from sugar?
A sugar detox?
Yeah.
Boy, that's actually a new question for me. I've never had that. Go ahead, Buzz.
Do you know?
No, I don't know about that.
I don't know. I'm just asking. I didn't know if you could.
I do know, at least what we've seen clinically, you have to be careful. A lot of people will start their diet with a detox, and I don't think that's a great idea because if you have, a lot of times your detox system, if you can't handle it, you get really sick.
Right.
So, and I know a lot of these diets out there will start with this big, heavy detox.
Right.
You really should get tested to make sure your liver, can handle that detox. If not, you're going to get sick as hell.
Right. And that's one of the things, and that's why I always try to give patients the 90-10 rule. And that's when we get back to the whole diet thing. Like, diet of total exclusion is generally not going to be sustainable for the general population. So I try to give most patients now, like I said, if somebody's trying to walk on stage, like, okay, you have less room for leniency. But a general person that wants to be fit, that says, I want to be able to see my abs, I want to feel good at the beach, things like that, give me two things. 90-10 rule. I tell them, if you're going to mess up, I'd rather you mess up really bad one time a week than a little bad every day. Like, I'd rather you not recreate that repeated exposure to refined carbohydrates on a daily basis. Because let's say you eat clean all week, and then on Saturday night, you're like, I'm going to go out and have dinner and dessert. I can handle that.
Yep.
But let's say you're like, I'm going to eat perfect every day, but I'm going to end every night with like a handful of candy. Well, you've elicited enough of a frequent exposure to the refined sugars, you're going to cause insulin resistance and you've wasted your time. And the reason that I try to get more lenient as I've gotten in this field more and I've gotten older and more reasonable with expectations is I've seen people that don't give themselves any wiggle room turn into problematic eating behavior. Right after college, I dated a girl that did figure competitions. She was in great shape, but I don't think she had a healthy relationship with food to where she would eat perfect for like a month. And then one day she decided she wanted pizza. And then pizza turned into ice cream. And I want pop with my pizza and everything else. And then she's nauseous. She's sick. She feels like she's going to throw up. And then she is emotionally devastated and mad at herself. And just like, I've ruined everything of that and everything else. And
That
I
was
gained 6
Buzz
pounds.
this morning when he ate a cookie.
Yeah.
It wasn't worth it.
Sabotage.
Pouting. I'm like, oh my
Sabotage.
gosh, come
Well,
on.
the problem is it wasn't worth it. If it's worth it, it wasn't worth it.
It's never worth it. It's never worth it. I mean, I have the same thing. I like sweets too, and I'll generally eat. My wife is phenomenal.
She's a great cook.
She gets up. She when we decided we want to clean our diet up, I always say I opposite diet. During the summer months, there's more to do here. So I'm out. I'm a little bit more relaxed with my food. Probably have a little bit more alcohol.
Yep.
So I always say I fatten up in the summer and I get thin in the winter
right,
because the winter comes, it's cold, there's nothing to do, and I'm like, well, I got nothing else to do. I might as well get myself in shape. So I'm like the world's dumbest dieter.
Yeah,
because I reverse seasons.
We do the opposite. Yeah, that's dumb.
But she, but when we did this, she's like, well, we got to eat better. So she gets up and she makes breakfast every single morning before I go to work. She goes to work at 7, so she gets up at like 5. So she's a godsend. And we prep and we take all of our meals to lunch every day, and we eat dinner at home every night. And if we do go out to dinner at somewhere that we can eat steak and veggies and things like that.
Yep.
But God, I do have a sweet tooth. And when it gets me the most is at nighttime, especially if I like wake up because I got something on my mind, which is a stress response.
Oh yeah, she said you're a night eater.
I am.
Yeah, I'm not a night eater.
I am. And I'll,
No, he likes to talk on the phone and go into the pantry and eat. He doesn't even know what he's eating. So like the other day I was in the
eating
pantry.
mustard yesterday.
Hang on, wait. The other day, hang on, yeah, listen. The other day I was in the pantry and I was like looking around and I found a butter knife in there and I was like, what are you doing? He goes, I wasn't doing anything. I know exactly what you're doing. You were eating this mustard out of the jar with the knife.
yeah.
And he doesn't even process what he's doing. He's just eating condiments.
See, I do that too, especially like at the nighttime. Our dogs, for some reason, at the end of the night when we get home, they decide they need to go out like 74 times between 8 and 11 o'clock at night. and Jamie wakes up in the middle of the night. I don't. So it's kind of our rule is like, I handle the dogs until we go to bed because she'll be the one that wakes up with them if she does. Cause I won't hear them,
Yep.
Yeah.
you know, but if they get me up enough all of a sudden, and I don't even think about it, I'll get up and I'll walk downstairs and Jamie will be like, where are you going? I'm like, oh yeah, I am going to the kitchen. Like, damn it.
That's great.
I'm like,
Well,
I already came
That's
this far
funny.
now.
This-
Yeah.
I kind of want to share, like, I think this is important to say. We're not perfect eaters,
No.
right? And we like to have fun. I'm a huge foodie. I love food. So does Buzz. So do you.
Yeah.
And so I have a rule with myself. It's like, okay, during the week, like I meal prep food, and I'm a very simple meal prep person. I don't like complicated meals. I don't like complicated things. So I'll make a ton of ground chicken. I have rice. I do like the red potatoes. We have lettuce, and like we'll figure it out from there. And that's like simple. And then every day I make breakfast for us because I love breakfast. And then we go out on date night one day a week.
Yep.
And we do our dinner and we might have a dessert. And then like at home, if we want something sweet, we love those Yasso bars.
Yeah.
I'm addicted to the Yasso
You
bar.
tried those? I know you like those.
Yeah, they're delicious.
Oh my God, I love the Yasso bar.
Okay.
And then I'll be like, oh, we're out of
Keep it in the house.
yeah, we're out of fudge. So we'll be like out of the fudge brownie, or we're out of the chocolate peanut butter. And I'm like, ooh, let's order more. So I'm like, order 7 boxes, you know?
Yeah.
We're like addicted to those. They're good.
Slippery slope with me for those is I'm like 100 calories. That means I can
Yeah,
have
a
3 of
couple,
them.
yeah,
Yeah.
like,
Yeah, Buzz
like-
is eating like 2, and I'm over here trying to just eat 1.
well, that's what we always, Megan and I joke in the office. Tiffany's dad is like a remarkably good baker, and he did some stuff with us. So we've been focusing really tightly with them as far as like gluten-free and things like that.
Oh,
So
yeah.
we'll make like gluten-free stuff, and it's amazing.
Oh,
How do
yeah.
you make gluten-free stuff taste good? Sugar and fat.
Yeah.
So he'll bring stuff in, and I'm like, oh, good. Phil finally brought in some more health cookies.
Yeah,
You know,
right.
like, these are health cookies because they're
Right.
gluten free, right? But yeah, I mean, it's all, and that's why I do try to preach. I don't try to preach anything, although it probably sounds preachy sometimes. I try to, from a coaching standpoint, influence patients on moderation, but also allowing themselves some grace,
Yeah.
right? You know what I mean?
I think that matters.
Well, if you,
Because I always
It's a
tell
marathon,
people,
not a sprint.
yeah, I want people to have fun. And I always tell people when I talk to them, like, look, would never tell you not to go and do this. I know I would never do that, right?
Yeah.
Like with the eating and stuff like that. So, yeah, I think it's like, I want to be fair, especially when people start functional medicine.
right.
That's like a whole different ballgame. And it's like, look, you're going to have some slip ups, but it's all in moderation, like you say.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, it is a lot of work, so you don't want to set somebody up for failure. You also don't want to get in their headspace and set them up for their own preconceived notion of failure, because people are generally, if you give them reasonable expectations, they will be honest. I had a patient the other day, I gave him the same thing, 90-10 rule.
Yep.
And it's nice for me for follow-up. He's like, hey, Joe, I got to be honest. I was 90-10. I was perfect for like 8 weeks. He goes, last 4 weeks, it's probably been 60-40, 70-30, because this and this and this. And I'm like, how do you feel? He's like, well, I'm not bad, but I kind of started feeling shitty again. So
Yeah.
you know,
Yes.
so it's
And that's the best thing is I think what I tell people too, I'll say, just try this out for 2 weeks,
Yeah.
see how you feel. Then go back to your old habits, right? See how you feel. And everyone will always tell you if they can stick with it for 2 to 3 weeks and they start to feel better and then they slip off, they will feel terrible.
Well, and I think people, like, we get so used to how we go, people don't really pay attention to how they feel when they eat. And then when you start coaching somebody like, hey, you mentioned this, next time you have this, I want you to pay attention to how you feel. And it even made me start being acutely aware of it as well, as far as like the bloating and the fullness when I eat things, which I
Yeah.
joke with Jamie, we generally go out to dinner once a night during the week. And that's when I'll have a little dessert or something like that. And I come home and look in the mirror and I'm like, oh my God, like, what happened, dude? You know,
Oh my
Was it
God.
worth it?
You're like,
What
why
was
did I
it?
do that?
I'm
No,
like,
when
you're
we-
married to me now. You're stuck.
yeah. Oh my gosh. Wow. Well, this was a great episode. I'm really excited for people to listen because a lot of people do have issues with sugar. A lot of people are insulin resistant. And I also like with the type 2 diabetes thing, if you do have type 2 diabetes, you can correct that.
Yes.
You
yes,
can.
You can.
Yeah.
Yep. And last note I'll put in here for patients, and I think we've talked about this before, you do not have to have a sugar issue on paper to have insulin resistance.
Yeah.
Right? Insulin resistance goes on 5, 10, 15 years before you ever start to see A1Cs and glucose levels pop, right? most of the time, what do we see? Centralized weight gain, cholesterol sneaking up, and then liver functions. So if you're having centralized weight gain, your belly's getting bigger and firmer, you're feeling lethargic, you crash after you eat. Just because your doctor's told you that your blood sugar's fine doesn't mean you're not insulin resistant.
Yeah,
good.
I like that. That's awesome. Well,
Good
Joe,
point.
thanks
Well,
for
thank
coming
you.
back on the show. I really
Thanks for
appreciate
having
it.
me.
I know we'll see you again.
Yeah.
And listen, if you're interested in anything that we talk about, or if we haven't hit a subject or you want to know something, just hit us up. You can DM us. Everything's going to be in the show notes. And if you have questions for Joe about anything that involves nutrition, I mean, I know that I personally would trust him over any traditional medicine doctor. But yeah, so stay tuned. Come back and join us.
All right. Thanks.
All right, thanks.
Good.